So we're going to now look at what are the differences working as an online counsellor with video counselling. What are going to be the differences to working with the client isn't in the room. That is the biggest difference, really. They are not physically there with us in the room. So we're basically cutting off some of the senses that we might use when a client is face-to-face with us. So we're taking away quite a lot of, obviously, our visual cues, that physical presence of having a client there with us. And so I guess we're sort of thinking that we're going to be losing some non-verbal cues, the way someone's sitting, we might not be able to see quite as well. If they're shuffling around, if they're moving around, we might not see that as much. We might not be able to hear if their breathing changes, things like that. So there's going to be some non-verbal cues as well that we're obviously going to miss. So listening and watching in different ways. So we have to listen and watch very carefully. This intensifies, and the ability to listen and sense in other ways increases. So when we take away one of our senses or one of our ways of picking up cues from a client, what happens, and what we don't realise happens, is that all of our other senses become intensified. So even though we're missing that one, our sense of listening, we will look much more at what we can see of the client, so their face, we will look much more at the visual clues we get from their face, we might tune in more to their tone of voice or what they're actually saying in their words. So we would normally do that when we're face to face with a client, but those sorts of parts will intensify because they're not physically in the room with us. The disinhibition effect is something that happens with all online work, whether that's sort of, with any online work, whether that's tech support, whether that is video counselling support, whether it's email support, whatever it is. And what that essentially is that because the client feels safer, they have fewer inhibitions. So they feel safer because they're in their own space, they're not physically with you in the room, they feel much more comfortable and at a distance from you. So they have fewer inhibitions, and so they work, the work can sometimes travel at a much faster pace. Clients can feel safer and more confident because they're in their own surroundings and feel more in control. This can affect the therapy in that it can become more intense, faster, less inhibitions. The client's feelings of shame and embarrassment are slightly diminished with a certain amount of anonymity that they get from being in their own space and away from you. So clients feel more able to feel and keep in control, in which case they share at a lot faster pace. So it's just really, it's being really aware of that. That is something that can actually make the work really quite intense, and actually can be, can sort of take us by surprise in a way. So as long as we're aware of that, as long as we're aware that they might suddenly disclose much quicker and faster, and the work might suddenly get in a lot deeper. So it's just being able to pick up on that and be aware that's the pace that it's travelling at. Okay. It's more of an equal setting really, and again that will increase feelings of confidence for the client. It's equal in that they're not coming to meet you. They're not coming into your space. They're in their space, you're in your space. It's much more equal. Again, that's going to change the dynamic slightly. Not upset the dynamic, but change it. It's being aware of that. It's much easier for the client to hang up or end the therapy. It's quite easy for them to just click that X button and boom, off they go. Again, they've got more confidence in being or in having online or video counselling. For a client, we could say a face-to-face client could get up at any time and leave their therapy, but actually for them to do that and for you to be physically in the room, they don't know if you're going to stand up and stop them or what might happen. Obviously we wouldn't do that, but when they're in their own space, you're at the end of you're just on a laptop, they can literally just close that lid down, boom, it's gone. So they feel they've got much, or it may feel that they've got much more power and control in that. Is that good? Is that bad? Who knows? It's just about understanding it and having it there in your mind when we're doing this. stronger boundaries and contracting are needed to set the therapy, right from the start, to put those boundaries in place right from the start. So, obviously we have a process, we have boundaries, we have a contract that we sign with the client that's face to face. But I guess I think with what I've found is that with setting a client up for video counselling is that we set much firmer boundaries initially before everything starts. So we let them know a lot more about the things they do and don't need to do and how the counselling will look and work, to try to set those boundaries and to try to set the parameters of how it will work before we get into that session. We might save a lot of the sort of housekeeping of timekeeping and those sorts of things to the first session when we meet with the client. But what I try to do with this is actually set that out in a contract beforehand, which I will talk about later. So, it's making sure those boundaries are held right from the start. So things are out of the counsellor's control that would normally be in control. So other people entering the room at their end, then popping out of the sessions, the session keep dropping out and cutting out, obviously. Those sorts of things are out of the counsellor's control. So being able to set boundaries initially as to what we're going to do if that happens makes client and counsellor feel safe and contained in those sessions. And these initially help the client to understand what video counselling is, and asserting the boundaries right from the start is essential in the contracting. As I say, we'll talk more about that later. Clients may be reluctant, thinking it seems a cheaper option than face-to-face, maybe it's not as real or as in-depth, and the client needs to be assured that it's just as real as face-to-face. I've not come across that, but it might be something to think about, that we might be thinking that when we meet with this client, they might be thinking it's not as good as face-to-face. It's assuring them that that's not the case. So the first session will be different because you're going at a much faster pace. You can go deeper a lot faster. So ask the client why they have chosen video counselling is quite an interesting thing to do as well. Is it because of, we might know that from the initial meeting or from the referral that we've got from our counselling coordinator. We might see that they live somewhere they can't get to. It might be because they are disabled and can't use public transport, whatever reason. So I guess having, finding that out, if you don't know the reason why they've decided to choose video counselling, would be interesting. And also as well, how they feel about it, being open and transparent from the beginning as to how they feel about having video counselling, Skype counselling, so you can get it out there right from the beginning that, this is therapy, this is real counselling, as it were. I guess it's recognising that first session might have that, that disinhibition effect might come straight in. So whereas sometimes our first few sessions with the client might take that time to build that trust up, sometimes it can dive straight in. So again, being aware of that. So the trust can be built quicker, that's a difference. Partial anonymity means intimacy is increased. So again, it's that same idea that, we're not fully seeing all of the client, or we're not, we see the client is still in their own space, so sometimes that intimacy can be intensified. So pace and the speed may be increased, as we talked about before, so it needs monitoring. Too much too soon, you may want to cut in or even cut the time short. So if you suddenly do realise that disinhibition effect is cutting in, and you're suddenly you're getting lots of information, it's going in really deep, it might be about, saying to the client, we've covered a lot of ground here, you've given me an awful lot of information, how about we just pause or just sort of take a break there and have a look at some of the things that you've mentioned. Or it might be you've got to sort of 40 minutes, and a huge amount has come out, and there's not been a time when you've been able to stop that flow. So what you might do is go, you've shared a huge amount of information there, obviously we've got 10 minutes remaining of the session, but I'm aware that you've opened up a huge amount, you've talked about a huge amount of things, and a lot of trauma traumatic events have gone on for you and that you've spoken about, how about we leave the session there for this week and go on from there. So don't be afraid to to adapt the session, if all of a sudden this disinhibition effect has just taken hold and off it's gone. So keep an eye on the pace and the speed. It may be different. Client can feel understood earlier on, again because of that disinhibition effect. Sometimes that can kick in. So the difference, obviously you're not in the room there, so the lack of connection in the room together. We may not see the body language as clearly. Obviously we can only see their upper body, and of course they can only see our upper body. So tuning in to our heightened senses will compensate for this, as I said earlier. So the client's projections may be different. It may be more or maybe less, but just be aware of it. How the client projects things onto, as they normally would, onto the counsellor. It may be slightly different. So self-disclosures may be easier for the client. They may self-disclose, again, quicker and faster. Having some distance from the client can make things cleaner. So again, it's not so much transference or counter-transference. Again, there's almost that sort of unconscious barrier, mapping the physical barrier of you not being in the same room. Again, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different, and it's just, paying attention to that and being aware of that. So more disturbances or interruptions. So contracting is imperative with the client, and that's the counsellor's responsibility to manage, and absolutely to have a plan of action if that happens. Okay. So again, when we talk about the contract, I will mention that more. But our clients, our counsellors here work in, even if they're doing their online video counselling, they work in from a counselling room. So there's not going to be any interruptions from our end. The door is shut, as it normally would be. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that later. So there's not going to be interruptions from the counsellor's end, but of course from the client's end we can't stop those interruptions, can we? So there may be other people coming into the room or different things happening. Again, I'll talk to you about how we contract around that right from the word go. But if that happens or keeps happening, it needs to come into the therapy. We need to be able to help the client to put those boundaries down about this being their own private space and their session that they need to keep as private as possible for them, really. Also as well, I guess interruptions from the counsellor's end. If the counsellor and the client are in a room together and there's a siren goes past the window outside, or there's a huge, someone shouting outside the window, both counsellor and client know that the noise is out the window and that's going on outside. If you're on a video counselling session and there's a huge amount of noise outside your counselling room window, it may be that we just need to be transparent and open about that. And say to the client, I don't know whether you heard that, but I just want to assure you that is outside the window. That is not anything going on in this room or in the building. Again, it's being open and honest and talking about different things that are going on. Don't leave things to, just sort of ignore them and think that they'll go away. It's much better to bring it in, really. So the work can be, so obviously we're still talking about the differences, and the work can be more draining for the therapist. It can be heavier, harder work and more intense because of the things that we talked about, that disinhibition effect. What you might be curious about is their vicinity, the vicinity that they are in, how might that affect you? Are we seeing more of a client even though we feel at a distance, So yeah, they're, however many miles away from us, they're just on a screen, but of course we see much more of them, don't we? We see much more of their surroundings, their space, are they in their kitchen, are they in their lounge, are there pictures up on the wall, what does their bedroom look like, the space that they're in. So again, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different, and it's being aware of that. What will that do for us as a counsellor? What will we, what sorts of things will be conjured up in our minds? Again, just that awareness, really. So withdrawal, we need to have a soft close. This is really important. So if we remember that, when the client finishes their session, it's the end. They press that button, boom, they're back into their life. So there's no transition time for them, there's no walking out of the building, there's no walking to their car, there's no travel time home, there's no time for them to sort of process or to just, have that time between ending counselling and getting back into their real life. It may be that, as soon as they come off the screen, there they are back in their real life, on the school run, doing this, doing that. So it's really important to have a soft close with online counselling, and what that might mean is you keeping an eye on the time as you normally would, but just letting them know that you're going to just, we've got 2 minutes left, or we've got 5 minutes left. What I'm aware of is that after this session that you're going to be back into your normal life, and I just want to, I was just wondering, what are you going to do after the session, or what sorts of things, might you be able to just sit where you are and just be able to process what we've talked about a little bit, or just keep yourself quiet for a time. So it's taking them back into it's grounding them essentially, which a lot of us as counsellors will do anyway, but it's just making sure that it's absolutely done, giving them that time to come into their own surroundings and in the here and now, and normalising things a little bit for them. Okay, so what are you going to do now? What's going to, where are you going? You're making yourself a cup of tea. What's going on? Also, the same for the therapist. Give yourself a moment to ground yourself. It will feel different clicking a button on a client than actually seeing them out of the room or the building. Pay attention to it, think about that, and think about how it feels. We do also have the text option on the video counselling, which again we will talk about in a moment, but it's keeping that to a minimum. Try to keep it, or again contract with the client that that's just kept to a minimum, and it's only really for very brief interactions. Don't manage that as you want to. If you really want to use the text, it works quite well, and some clients do want to interact all the way through it, but be aware. Put the boundaries down and set it as you want to do. If you don't want to be doing that a lot, you need to tell the client that it's just for use in this situation or that situation. Remember, when you come to the text, no emojis, no capital letters, even if the client is doing that. As the counsellor, don't put those things in. Emojis can be misconstrued. We may be totally out of touch as to what, I know I use emojis in a totally different way to my teenage sons do. So stay away from the emojis, and as I say, stay away from the shouted capitals. And also with the text, it's about explaining to the client on the first session what the text button can be used for. Okay, which again we'll talk about in a moment. Okay.